All right, if we could maybe settle down so that we can start our second keynote. Closer. Are we missing it? Are we missing anyone? No, I don't think so. Maybe, yeah. All right, so good morning again, everyone. Welcome to our second keynote of this conference, which I think has been, Edwige and I were just talking, I think nicely set up by the morning panel. So we're really looking forward to this. So I'm very delighted to introduce Edwige Tamalet, who is Associate Professor of French at Tulane University. I contacted Edwige in the early days of the Thanatic Ethics project because I saw that she was somebody who was working in kind of, relevant and related areas to the project. And she responded extremely kindly and has since been quite an active member of the network. She presented in our first conference, our first workshop, I guess we called it then, during COVID online. And then has also more recently contributed to the special issue with interventions. So it's indeed, we're very delighted. It's indeed a great pleasure to have her be our keynote for this conference. So Edwige has written a number of books, most recently Water Logics, which is forthcoming, and she's also currently working on yet another book called The Residual Migrant. She does really fascinating work on sort of on water, on the agency of water, and the standpoint of water as an epistemological site. So her talk is going to be about water again. So we're really looking forward to her talk. So I'll just leave it at that and let her begin. Edwige, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I think it's a little closer. Thank you very much to our three organizers. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. Last time when I presented online, and it was 2:30 a.m. for me, local time. So I wasn't fully alert. I hope I will be a lot more present today. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me to continue working with this really inspiring network of scholars. I was extremely interested in the project from the get-go, and I was delighted to hear from you when you reached out. The intervention special issue, for those of you who don't know it, is sensational. So I really urge you to go and take a look. And I'm very, very humbled by the quality of the papers this time around too. And it's an absolute pleasure to be able to engage with so many of you through my work. Today, especially the panels this morning and the keynote yesterday, I think there's a continuity in some of the concepts that we've been looking at that's going to be really generative. So thank you for this opportunity. So this is a brand new take on the project. So it's on water, but it's also on a lot more than water this time. I'm actually a little bit out of field, out of my comfort zone here. I am a scholar of literature. This is going to be not about literature. It's going to be about visual arts to some extent. It's going to be about theory, which is mostly what I do these days. But it's also something new in the sense that I'm trying to create a corpus and trying to create a sort of epistemological approach to this corpus that expands on the work I have done in this context on the residual migrant. And I will talk a little bit about that at the beginning of the paper, but also taking it a little more towards affect and feeling and sensorial exposure, which is really the concept I'm going to try to develop today. So without further ado, I would like to start with, it's not working anymore. Let's see, yes, with some verse. And this incredible verse here, which is part of an installation art form by Emily Leach, called Residence Time. And I will be reading the verse here, to the bodies of the drowned, the jettisoned, and those who walked into the water, suspended in residence time. Such are the searing, devastating words embroidered on a square of translucent fabric, loosely suspended in columnar shape in Emily Leach's work, Residence Time. Timeless words, haunting words, steeped in the Atlantic's haunted history of slavery, fluidly swirling in the slight whirl of the fabric, forever figuring the gentle rocking of the water as bodies descend into the abyss, water enfolding them, enclosing them, proprietary and suffocating, until body and water are just one, dissolved and illegible, rendered to sheer materiality, indistinct, haphazard, a blur. Residence time, writes Leach, marks the duration of persistence of a substance in an absorbed, suspended, or dissolved state. It is the time of dwelling in water, the time of exposure, of dwelling in the dissolve, in Stacey Alamo's words, the time of scalar intersection between the finitude and finitude of the biological human subject on the one hand, and on the other hand, the forces of Gaia, planetary, infinite, geological in their temporal reach. Trying to move on to the next slide. Yes, okay. By Stacey Alamo, the quote here, contemplating your shell on acid dissolves individualist consumerist subjectivity in which the world consists primarily of externalized entities, objects for human consumption. It means dwelling in the dissolve, a dangerous pleasure, a paradoxical ecodelic expansion and dissolution of the human, an aesthetic incitement to extend and connect with vulnerable creaturely life and with the inhuman and fathomable expanses of the seas. It is to expose oneself as a political act. Dwelling in the dissolve then as an imperative, that of subjecting one's flesh to the lasting imprimatur of geophysical forces, to their intimate intrusion, their disassembling of organic cohesion, reducing the sovereign body of the subject of Western modernity to molecular substance, to residue. And this is what I have previously called in my earlier work with this group, the residual migrant. So I have a quick definition of residuality here, and then a quote, which I will read, the residual migrant, and this is from the Thanatic Ethics special issue of Intervention. A watery disincarnation of the derogated migrant subject, whose blending into geophysical matter eschews necropolitical obliteration and disappearance. Beyond any eradicating logic, the intimate entanglement between eruptive bodies and watery environments sheds light on the persistence of the human in other material forms. This is the starting point of this reflection. So allow me now to take you on one last poetical detour, one reinserting the waters of dissolve within the migratory ambit occupying us this week. And I'll be looking at Richard Blanco's Matters of the Sea, a poem written to commemorate the thaw, the deshielo in US-Cuban relations under the Obama administration in 2014. A poem fundamentally absorbed in the delineation of a mode of being in water, through water, across water. The sea doesn't matter. What matters is this: we all belong to the sea between us, all of us. Listen again to the echo. The sea still telling us the end to our doubts and fears is to gaze into the lucid blues of our shared horizon, breathe together, heal together. Firmly anchored in the Florida Strait, separating Cuba from the Florida Keys, itself another deadly maritime crossing, this verse materializes water as a communal space of encounter and togetherness. As the poetic voice intimates, we all belong to the sea between us. This betweenness overstitches mortuary visions of maritime space with conceptions of water as a sensory common, as a molecular space, a space where matter comes to matter in different ways, a space where subjects then simply ebb away and deposit in the underwater environment, where they don't simply commute ontologically or materially to residue, but rather commune through their senses in a unified waterborne position in the world. In the poem's idiom, this form of being requires, and I quote, listening again to the echo, gazing into the lucid blues, breathing together, even healing together in a refutation of the traumatic lingering of the wake of drowning, of its intrinsic ontological suspension.
the suspension of Leach's work, Suspended in Residence Time. The continuum between these two poems does important critical work for us. So I will point out a few different directions. It illuminates the power of water to subvert, to disassemble the supposedly watertight demarcation between body and element, between subjecthood and matter. Second, it brings to the fore the key importance of the senses as mediators for subjective engagement with our waterborne legacies of biopolitical violence, disappearance, or remnants, as in Blanco's poem. Third, it points to the centrality of an elemental perspective, here centered on water, as a vector for reparative practices aiming to restore a sense of togetherness, breathing together, healing together. And fourth, it spotlights the essential role played by the human sensorium in any reflection on representations, perceptions, and intuitions related to subjective experiences of entanglement with the elements, but also, and more important perhaps, the importance of the human sensorium in mediating awareness of our common destiny through careful observation of the elemental nature of water. In this respect, reading these two poems side by side reveals a crucial nexus of sensoriness and cognitive awareness that develops from considerations of exposure to water through submersion, be it in the aftermath of trauma, residence time for the jettisoned enslaved bodies entering the ocean's longue durée timeframes, or as a common praxis, or rather the praxis of commonality through which trauma is confronted and resolved together in Blanco's vocable. So, concepts now. This lecture proceeds from the hypothesis of a material sensory archive of maritime spaces that function as overdetermined sites of loss and necropolitical power, like the Atlantic of the slave trade or the Florida Straits. Sites throbbing with the remnants of those who have drowned, sites of disappearance and ontological instability, but also spaces of passage in physical encounters, rippling with haunting echoes of lives lost, of bodies disintegrated, mutated, dispersed into the surrounding waters. In maritime crossing sites, the corrosive encounters between sacrificed body and water reveal the multiple imbrications between the human and the aqueous, their mutual lacerations. The obsessive attention to borders and surveillance intrinsic to a security-based approach to mobility constricts paradigms of life to their biopolitical manifestations. You can see here routes devised as a sort of counter practice against those rules and impediments. Geophysical spaces morph into spaces of exception to reverberate on Freya's haunting installation. Spaces where the exercise of a controlled form of sovereignty reduces existence to a logic of objection. This forms a backdrop of ever-increasing incorporation of watery bodies into practices of border policing and surveillance, and pervades interchangeability among the drowning, dehumanization, invisibility, disappearance. In contrast to this logic, this lecture aims to refocus our lens on the singularity of death by water, of each occurrence of death by water, an intimately personal, lived event that cannot be experienced in its totality, but at the price of total annihilation, an event that can only be evoked through imaginative projection, and more appropriate to our reflections today, through the senses. So to think through the imaginative, I take my cue here from Lawrence Buell's 1995 eponymous book, The Environmental Imagination, which puts the spotlight on the cognitive processes through which readers come to envision and apprehend the world. Taking imagination further, I look to Robert Harvey's cutting-edge philosophy of the witness, to which I will return momentarily, which argues that imagination must at least be as important for our potential for witnessing as is reason. In the distinctive context of installation art, we will therefore train our lens on the sensory aesthetic regime mobilized to render the uniquely individual solipsistic experience of deadly submersion at sea. We will ponder the question of art's ability to embody the ineffable, intimate absence-presence of the drowning, its ability to bear witness. Yet the accounting for and possible claim for redress triggered by the event of drowning vanishes together with the decomposing body, and this is our paradox. A side effect of the material dissolution of the drowning, of the completion of their fusion with the elements, is the void that a dispersed body leaves behind. As we know, a significant percentage of the dead are never recovered, never identified. So how to hold the political forces weaponizing water to account, how to bear witness to the event of a fully preventable drowning, one that by definition occurs in the interstices of technologies of surveillance. To answer these questions, I would like to turn to the practices of witnessing and to bring it to bear on the issue of sensoriness that we are discussing today. The practice of bearing witness holds several distinct meanings in tension. In its classical juridical understanding, witnessing designates the utterance of a testimony by a testis who was present and directly experienced the event. So in our context, somewhat improbably, someone who would have experienced the drowning and dissolution of the self under the onslaught of water and who would have come back to tell the story. But it is another form of witness that I wish to spotlight here, rather a vicarious form of witness. One whose testimony is based on empathy and imagination, one in which the testis lends their body to the haunting perpetrated by the drowned in what Jean Laplanche would call an afterwardly moment of hospitality, through which the recipient lends corporeal shape to the loss, incarnates it as a ghostly presence, animating it. And it is interesting, of course, to refer back to the discussion on spectrality and the spectra that we had yesterday. So let's turn to Harvey for more precise understanding of what witnessing entails. In his path-breaking 2010 essay, Witnessness, Robert Harvey delineates the contours of forms of witness by proxy, a posture where the witness tends to substitute himself for the victim, speaking for him, acting as his proxy. Where absolute witnessing of the event implies death and decomposition, only a suppletive process of witnessing can ensure that the experience suffered at the mercy of the elements does not get obliterated. Witness by proxy solidifies the contour of water deaths. It circumscribes it within the cultural fabric of remembrance and primes it for the possibility of redress. In other words, witnessing surges as an attempted remedy to both the irrepresentability of the event for anyone who did not personally experience it, and the impending death of the absolute witness, the one who will experience the drowning to the point of disintegration. A witness by proxy stands in for the dead, embodies their story. This witness inhabits a space of alterity, not simply deployed in the abstract, as Frank LeCapra notes, but one with actual others, possibly empathic, trustworthy others. Others sharing in the burden of mediating a certain subjective experience. Following Didier Huberman's contention that the image holds the potential to entice the viewer to moral action, Harvey places witnessing at the core of a universal ethical mode of intersubjective relation, which he calls witnessness, and that's the second quote here, a state of consciousness emblematized by the witness before witnessing and accessible to all. One where the self opens up for what he calls the visitation of the spirit of the dead, which in itself is another form of residence. The form of testimony nurtured by this witnessing lacks the factual objectivity of the event. It is one relieved of the burden of verisimilitude and attachment to a specific occurrence in space and time. This testimony is not meant to record any specific event. It does not point the way toward any evidentiary model to be used juridically. This is another form of testifying, one that aims to recover the memorial weft of the drownings, to give voice, to give body to the revenant, to expose oneself or a surrogate to the lacerations of submersion, to its corrosion. It literally takes the plunge. So, in this perspective, witnessing designates a process of empathy through which the viewer can identify and with which, to some extent, blend with what is observed. Yes, this witness was never there in space, in time, in flesh. So the question of accessibility to the event from a vicarious position needs to be posed. And I will end with a few questions here before we get into the analysis of some of the art. What kind of witnessness, so to borrow Harvey's concept, if any, does art mediate? How to memorialize the event of the drowning, which is by nature solipsistic and in this model dissolutive. How to hold on to the remains, which is a question that we've already engaged with. And finally, what would a sensory aesthetics of exposure look like, and what would its ethical modalities and limits be? And this is what the rest of the presentation will aim to elucidate. So to understand how this empathetic fusing of two bodies operates, I would like to turn to what neuroscientist Vittorio Gallese has called embodied simulation, here, which she defines as a common functional mechanism at the basis of both body awareness and basic forms of social understanding. And here is a longer quote from an abstract, in fact, of Gallese's work. I'll read the quote. The same neural structures involved in the unconscious modeling of our acting body in space also contribute to our awareness of the lived body and of the objects that the world contains. Neuroscientific research also shows that there are neural mechanisms mediating between the multi-level personal experience we entertain of our life, of our lived body, and the implicit certainties we simultaneously hold about others. Such personal and body-related experiential knowledge enables us to understand, and I would like to add, and to feel the actions performed by others, and to directly decode the emotions and sensations they experience. This embodied form of cognition, therefore, layers subjective perception into the object of viewing, welding what Gallese calls first-person experience with third-person perspectives. Through embodied simulation, Gallese therefore proposed a revised concept of representation, and this is something we talked about yesterday, but which I would like to slightly revise here in this paper, the idea of representation not as a coercive practice of appropriation and ventriloquism, robbing the disappeared subject of agency, but rather, following Gallese, a particular type of content generated by the relations that are situated and interacted brain-body system instantiates with the world of others, end of quote. In other words, representation unleashes viewers' emotional responses and facilitates sensory and cognitive identification, blurring the distinction between subject and object of the viewing experience, included on the physical level. In other words, it paves the way for empathy. And this is particularly true of filmic cognition in this paradigm, made mostly, I quote, of gestures, actions, intentions, and emotions inscribed in a space-time shaped by film-style camera movements and montage. And this is what we will be analyzing in some of the artwork today. So in an effort to shed light on this process, we will now embark on a brief excursus through works of subversion that shed light on a multi-sensory epistemology encompassing soundscapes, haptic exposure to the elements, so the sense of touch, and visual cues of anamorphism to render the irrepresentable, the absence presence of drowning, palpable for the viewer. So keeping this idea of submersion in focus, a number of works come to mind. Many artistic works have focused on motifs and representations of underwater immersion in a corrosive perspective. In the Caribbean and beyond, I'm thinking, for instance, of these underwater sculptures by Jason Decaires-Taylor, and here, so this is in Grenada. We also have in Martinique, Laurent Valère, Montpellier, which is a canonical piece now that Washoe talks about at length in her book, which have dotted seabeds across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, memorializing the loss of life and the objection of biopolitical dynamics, while restoring awareness of the co-agency of body and water by letting the marine environment take over the sculptures and turn them into living parts of underwater life. So in this context, I would now like to turn to the film, if you could help me. Somewhere. Okay. Well, I'll start introducing it, and then maybe, yes, thank you. Maybe you can get the YouTube video started. So we will consider the biggest chunk of analysis that we will engage in here. We'll engage the piece of video art by South African artist Bernie Searle that was commissioned by the Foundation ENMAC Montpellier Arte Contemporáneo in Spain in 2003. Oops. That is called Home and Away. I have a problem with the mic. Sorry, can you just make sure it doesn't fall again? So Searle is a mixed race Cape Town native who gained prominence for using her own body as incarnation of the multiple traumas fracturing South African society around race and gender. I'm thinking here of a 98 series, for instance, Color Me. So this particular piece that we will look at, and it's only about 6 minutes long, so I would like to allow us to really experience it from start to finish, and then I'll do the analysis. So we're going to look at it in a minute, but I'll give you a little bit of context. It is entitled Home and Away, and the artist, as the artist herself avers, it aims to question notions of identity in light of the excruciating experience of migration. Now, this is roughly 15 years before the so-called migrant crisis of 2015. So obviously the way people and artists used to engage with migration was less urgent than what we've been doing since 2015. So undoubtedly the sense of emergency and urgency regarding the migrant question remains a bit remote in this early kind of art. But it still belongs in the corpus. It has been understood to belong in the corpus of art dealing with migration, and it provides a very interesting perspective, especially of the embodiment of the drowning migrant. But we have to keep this early time frame in mind because it doesn't look like anything we've seen since. Okay. All right. So a reflection on the danger of dichotomies and the mutability of identity, Home and Away performs what critic Ivan de la Torre has dubbed a lyrical flight above the waves. The piece represents the artist, Bernie Sorrell herself, floating in the waters of the Strait of Gibraltar between Morocco and Spain, between Tangier and Tarifa, whose mountainous contours, the famed Pillars of Hercules, if you remember your mythology, is a distant backdrop to the experience. So caught in between a forsaken home and the hope for a better life, the physical sensory encounter between the body and the elemental space of the sea holds the piece in focus as the artist herself becomes witness, bodily vessel, abandoning herself to the sea's cadence, to its churning. So without further ado, I will now play the piece for us, and I'll resume analysis after. I love. You love. He loves. We love. You love. They love.
You leave. They leave.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay. So this is a text basically that she utters through the piece. So focalization and a reflection on the viewer's perspective here hold the key to the mutable sensory ontology of Searle's piece. In the first section, the one on love, the viewer is enticed to merge with the body of the swimmer. The undulating rhythmical motion is impressed on the capture of the moving sky in the left window. It betokens the amalgamation of the viewer's perspective and that of the floating body. Camera lens, bather, and spectator are all permeated by the lulling scansions of the currents, the undertow of the tide. The very texture of the sky turns leaky, blurry with the ebbing and flowing of the waves. Sky and sea unite into a cerulean blur, engulfing the viewer and her object in a synesthetic experience. I love, you love, recites the voiceover. By visually merging with the swimmer's perspective, the viewer comes to feel the buoyancy of the body on the screen. She inhabits the swimmer's sensory perceptions. We hear the twittering of the birds, feel the blinding sunlight flooding the top right corner of the frame, the anticipated burn of the sun on the skin, and most powerful of all, the motion of the water beneath over into the body. All conspire to erode the boundary between viewing subject and ocular object, between body and other body, between self and matter. Here, corporeality anchors an ontological sense of instability, mediated by both physical and symbolic forces. He loves, the voiceover continues, causing the time of fusion between I and you to fade into the position of exteriority introduced by the third person. He, the third person itself, according to Harvey, functioning as a grammatical marker that characterizes witnessness. At this point of fracture, the borders of Searle's aqueous matrix loom on the horizon. Two mountain masses appear on the screen, if you remember, two static geological pillars hemming in a spherical molecular universe in perpetual becoming. The coastline of Morocco first, then of Spain, reinstating the dimension of geopolitical space, its striations. The plenitude of submersion in the all-engulfing azure of the elements surrenders to consideration of distance, perspectives, hierarchies. The camera at that point straightens up, reintroducing verticality and structure. We are now viewing the sea from an above water position. So the intrusion of the third person pronoun bespeaks an externality to the bonded unit, an intrusive gaze. The viewer deserts a position of full immersion into the frame to join the margins of the screens. The focal disjunction resulting from this migration of the gaze is deepened by the presence of two competing screens. Irremediably left out, the viewer toggles between the two viewpoints, unable to find focal stability. The perpetual motion and lability of the waterborne body on the right betrays a sense of precarity, an intrinsic vulnerability of the body at the mercy of the elements. The ebb and flow of clear water intermittently washing over the arms and the face suggests a deeper, more insidious form of immersion. The solidarity experienced with the artist's body now implies abandoning one's external position as a viewer following the disappearance of Searle's body, which dwindles out of frame, out of the field of vision. As the voiceover moves from a register of fusional love and reciprocity to one of feeling and bounded embodiment, I feel, you feel, she feels, etc., the submersion of the opening frames recedes into the larger scale of the landscape. Those at sea are the ones gently moving away from the shoreline, the ones being incrementally integrated into the expanding space of the sea that progressively dwarfs the landmass, substituting itself to it. Here, the focus squarely lies on the volume of the ocean, on its texture, on its potency as geological agent. The body gets pushed out of the frame by the churning water. The sea's density colors the chromatic palette, which now skews to darker tones. And we're thinking of Kalatani here too. The final shot of the sea will be dark, right? Completely black. As the voiceover whispers, we feel a confession here pulsating with the echo of the near homonymic. We fear a growing mass of seaweed comes into focus, if you remember. Or maybe a squirt of black ink, the kind released by a squid at the moment of impending danger. At first unrecognizable, a touch of foreign in the midst of the known, this dark hue is evocative of an oil spill. The all-encompassing embrace of this sky-sea continuum, lending unity and protection to the cradle body, is here torn asunder. This amniotic transmaterial bubble is soiled, contaminated, permeated by external elements, bringing to mind the ecological devastation and widespread ruin that comes of Europe's perpetual logic of crisis and extractive relation to nature. The collective we introduced in the phrase we feel can therefore only take shape in the aftermath of devastation as a patchwork of ravaged forms of life, each telling their own story of precarity and loss. Under the weight of this we, the body absconds, leaving center stage to the forces of nature and its more than human forms that eventually prevail over the anthropological. The last camera close-up on the body figures it metonymically through the perpetually reformed folds of a waterlogged dress, pleats of fabric blending in with the waves and kelp floats, uniting in a Baroque aesthetics of saturation. And I'm thinking of Deleuze's theory of the fold here. The repetition of the pleats across the aqueous medium performs a virtualization of the body, concurrently everywhere and nowhere on the screen. When it finally glides back into view, it is as a small fragmented figure in the distance, head and hand bobbing up and down in a grotesque disjunctive mode. Blurring the line between playful paddling and postmodern drifting, the movement of the immersed body in this last segment spotlights its vulnerability, its exposure. As the voiceover intones the last litany of the piece, I leave, you leave, etc., the body fades away for good, enacting a full disappearing act. This is actually Van der Waals' expression. It's not mine, but it's beautiful. Disappearing act is exactly what we're talking about here. A mere dot waning in the distance, indistinguishable from the crest of surrounding waves. I leave, murmurs the voice, and so the body does. As the next conjugation is layered over the image of the agitated sea, the ship upon which the camera is placed can be seen speeding away, abandoning the body behind. The vessel itself remains invisible to the gaze, elided. The wake is all that remains. The trail left behind by the boat, churning and heaving where placid waters had stood, lending volume to oceanic matter, emphasizing its might to the detriment of the now maroon and soon to be dissolved human subject. The last echoing syllables, they leave, reintroduce the communal dimension in the space of the wake, a space of haunting and spectrality, and we will talk about Christina Sharp a little bit later in the paper, a space of physical violence revealing the tensions inherent in human aquatic intimacies. The space of belonging attached to the pronoun they is one defined by its many exclusions. Homelessness, nostalgia, and transience, such are for Searle the feelings that this installation aims to instill in the viewer. Disjointedness too, I would add, and the inability to belong, the spectator's gaze as peripatetic and rudderless as the drifting migrant body. The haptic felicity saturating the first stage is belied here by a more somber reality, represented by the coming into focus of the boat's wake. And we are here, of course, reminded of the dark waters that we were evoking earlier, a wake of abjection and denial, one that has time and time again proved fatal to the aspiring migrant. In this watermark reading, water materializes both as life-giving substance in the first segment of the video and as a necropolitical agent in the closing stage, water as an instrument of biopolitical violence and suppression of drowning clandestine migrants in the formerly colonial and deeply historicized Mediterranean Sea. Water, simply put, is archived, memorializing through the residue and tubes the disjunctive histories that play out on its surface. What Valérie Loiseau has called the memorial agency of the landscape, its reverberation of past losses, comes to overlay the parameters of Searle's own identitarian quest. Through it, drowning migrants are resurrected. By choosing to remain in the water after the departure of the boat, Searle relinquishes the privilege of sovereignty and protection afforded to her as a South African citizen, and opts to embody for us, though certainly with blind spots and complex ethical ramifications, and we can talk about it in the Q&A, she comes to embody the subject position of the absent migrant body. Her poetic act of submersion doubles as a theoretical fulcrum with which to rethink embodied empathy and witnessing. Both an ethical and political act, exposure as a performative practice establishes what Stacey Alamo calls material rather than abstract alliances. It inhabits a fraught sense of political agency that emerges from the perceived loss of boundaries and sovereignty. Exposure then, making oneself the contained, removed, hegemonic subject of exploitative theological modernity, vulnerable to the fathomless forces of external, more than human entities. For the human subject, this means leaving behind the safety of a sheltered position of mastery over nature, to fully immerse oneself in the flow of oceanic matter in search of new ontological anchorings. Such impetus stems from an epistemological awakening. It cultivates a willful reclaiming of human vulnerability that calls into question any notion of transcendent subjectivity that would exist in isolation from its immediate material environment. In the aesthetic economy of Searle's installation, performing exposure is making room for the absent figure of the migrant, clearing the path for a consideration of her multiple traumas and losses, of her ontological homelessness once submersion has severed any bonds to the land left behind. This very political project, however, is not without its risks, some of them having to do with the extreme aestheticization of the experience represented on the screen. Yet, as the forlorn subject is abandoned to the churning waters, the viewer's unmoored gaze follows the up and down movement of the abandoned body, lulled by the initial sensorial simulation into an embodied perspective, where body and water dissolve into the sea. When the camera starts dipping down to the bubbling wake of the speeding motorboat, consideration of depth and volume and elemental force surge into view. The drowning and decomposing putatively awaiting this body, the same process, laying all but certain waste to the flesh of actual clandestine migrants, is thus suggested through the metaphor of the wake, heralding water's power of destruction. The final shot inches closer to the aqueous substance, closing up on its deep-colored, unfathomable abyss. And the brooding, dark surface, vistas of menacing seabed-level activity can be imagined. As the right screen gradually blacks out, the apprehensive viewer is left to plumb the ramifications of the darkness, death omnipresent and yet elusive. Okay, I will now move on to a quick analysis of this artwork, which was part of the Sing Without Trace exhibit, and Cédric's bakery yesterday showed some pictures of it. So I had to say a few words about it. I will, as a kind of point to finish, I will just consider a little bit of what's happening here with this piece. So this is by Danish artist Nikolaj Bendik Skyum Larsen's End of Dreams in 2015, which uses film, sculpture, photography, and sound to craft a visual and auditory response to the ongoing migrant so-called crisis. The installation won the 2016 Inga and Eivind Kohl Christensen's Funds Honorary Award. It is made up of 48 statues representing bodies of clandestine migrants, concealed from sight by concrete casings in the shape of body bags that have often come to metonymize shipwreck deaths in publicly circulated images. So it's very evocative to the viewer in this sense. And like other artistic engagements with migrant death, however, End of Dreams takes the long view toward anthropomorphic representation to tackle the material aftermath of dying at sea. The installation was meant to be submerged in the Tyrrhenian Sea off the coast of southern Italy. So you can see here what was done with it for the duration of a year. So the concrete casing is very interesting because it was sculpted out of a material known as concrete canvas, which is a geosynthetic filled with concrete, often used in environmental mitigation projects, whose surface hardens upon contact with water to form a low carbon waterproof layer. So concrete canvas is in fact known to be used in emergency relief situations. So there are all kinds of echoes to environmental catastrophe, logic of crisis, human rights issues, etc. So this is a very symbolic material in and of itself. And in addition, it is compatible with earth berming, which is the practice of adding a layer of earth or sand to the outside of a structure to improve thermal protection, which makes it one of the most environmentally friendly materials to date. So just this in itself is extremely significant. So it speaks to the breadth of Larsen's vision here, where geophysical properties as an altering force, corrosive force, are concerned. The texture of the casings allows a certain degree of malleability, also that ensures that the concrete fabric is imprinted by the movement of the water over time. So after the 1-year immersion period, the statues were due to join a traveling exhibition to exhibit what happens underwater after a year, the wear and tear occasioned by the long sojourn in water exposed to the eyes of the world. But a violent sea storm soon laid waste to the project by damaging the statues beyond repair. Of the original 48, only 11 survived, so they were basically dispersed by the storm. 11 survived, 2 of which were still found hanging from the original drafts, only 2. So in an uncanny congruence of concept and event, the environmental crisis looming large in Larsen's preoccupations invited itself into the artwork. Significantly, the brute force of the freak storm unleashed uncontrollable patterns of mobility, where the symbolic migrant bodies found themselves moved by uncontainable geophysical activity, a staggering occurrence revealing the deep conjunction of biopolitical violence, so water drowning these migrants because they are bereft of legal protection, and environmental violence unleashing unsurvivable conditions. The storm episode reveals the overlaying of multiple crises, so the migration crisis and the environmental crisis, generative of an ever more powerful and destructive pattern of storms, both of which are caused by the same predatory extractive logic of profit and progress at the root of so many migrations. So we have this very interesting opening of the perspective toward the environmental side of things. And more from the raft, the statues found refuge in the seabed, at times partially covered in sand. The process of tracking them down, which unfolded over several months, followed a similar arch to that of a forensic investigation. And this brings to mind the exceptional work done by the Forensic Architecture Collective, which I remember from our first exploratory panel, created by Lorenzo Vezzani and Charles Hilaire in tracking down migrant boats. So Larsen's assistant himself performed several dives to attempt to locate the missing statues and recorded his efforts on camera. And there is a film, I don't have time to show it to you, but there are a few excerpts online. If you go to the website, you will find them and you can actually see the recovery. It becomes a narrative unto itself, so that's really interesting. The resulting footage was edited and mixed and started its own journey. So they couldn't show the statues anymore, but they started talking about the whole process and showing the video as well as the recovery process. So it became a slightly different argument about migration and exposure that implicated the environment in a much more significant way. And so this video toured exhibits in Turkey, Denmark, Belgium, Italy, England, and the USA. Larsen's view from below reveals the underpinnings of full submersion and the kinds of vistas that an immersed perspective pervades. Like specters, Larsen's drifting figures inhabit an unmappable, unfathomable space. Most of them proved irrecoverable and thus met the same fate as the migrant bodies that they were meant to figure. So this in itself is incredibly interesting. That this appearance under the all-powerful agency of the sea begs the aesthetic consideration of what remains unsaid, mute because invisible, especially since the process of visibilization to which Larsen lays claim eventually falls prey to the obliterating logic which it aimed to defy. The statues get very damaged, dispersed themselves. And of dreams will ultimately be memorialized in terms of its lost status contingent. What is imperious to sight, parsing knowledge, what lies beyond representation. Maybe this is a form of this opacity that Catherine Bernard was talking about yesterday beautifully in her talk. The perspective here is one that relies on non-sensory forms of apprehension. The work of exhumation carried out is only defined by the bodies that it fails to excavate, to retrieve, to redeem. Its work of witnessing enabled only by the acknowledgement of its intrinsic limits. Larsen's original project, the intended circulation of the statue's remains, debris, and wreckage across museums, finds itself diminished if we consider it in the perspective of the loss of the majority of his statues. Yet the memorialization of migrant drownings that it purported to enact finds itself magnified, supercharged by the unpredictability of water entombment, adding to the physical archive of derogated bodies disposed at sea end of dreams crosses the line between memorialization and life imitating art, imitating life. So we have this extremely interesting circle here happening, which finds its deepest resonance in its acceptance of the mysteriousness and impossibility to exhume of dwelling in the abyss, this experience of dwelling in the abyss in the lethal hydrocommunes that is the Mediterranean. So against the impulse to document, to chart, to catalog or display, Larsen's piece is at its most resonant, in fact, when considered for the space of deployment that it opens up around and beyond the statues, a space of entropy and dissolve, what Larsen himself has dubbed a space of contemplation, that of a quiet, gentle, slightly sad, mystical, spiritual experience, end of quote. In other words, and in our vocable, the space of exposure. So to conclude now, I would like to return to our original consideration of Emily Leach's words reverberating with the power of underwater dwelling and its distinctive ontologies to the bodies of the drowned, the Jensen, and those who walked into the water, suspended in residence time. And I will now engage a little more with the concept of the wake and Christina Sharp's work on residence time. Christina Sharp's concept of residence time, which Leach overrides, appropriates the time of the wake, that of the slave ship, illuminating the dialectic of blackness and being in the space of drowning. Like us, Sharp writes, these bodies are alive in hydrogen, in oxygen, carbon, phosphorus, iron, in sodium and chlorine. They are with us still. Sharp calls being in the wake inhabiting a zone of non-being, insisting that inhabiting here is the state of being inhabited, occupied, and also being or dwelling in. It is being penetrated as much as penetrating the surrounding waters. The question of how to exist, how to remain in the zone of non-being, raises the issue of aftermath and haunting, the unpredictable ongoingness of dwelling. Decomposed matter points to the cross-contamination of water and body tissue, to their joining in death and through endless cycles of material afterlives. Maroon body figures, in Catherine Newsouth's resounding ascriptions, are an object that has collided with its specter to provide its own haunting. Through the dissolutive ontologies that we have delineated today, water's memorial density is revealed, its elemental ability to sustain the undulations of remembrance, its molecular archiving. In closing, I would like to borrow the words of Judith Butler that I applied to dissolutive ontologies that would not be simply a matter of a simple entry of the excluded into an established ontology, but an insurrection at the level of ontology. And I'd like to meditate on this a little bit. It is a critical opening up of the questions. What is real? Whose lives are real? Whose lives are livable, as we have asked time and again? And more importantly of all, perhaps, how might reality be remade? The last one is Judith Butler's quote. Today's exploration of the sensoria of exposure, or the lack thereof, points to a reassembling of bodily matter through cognitive empathy. Harvey's vicarious witness, secondhand witness, functions first and foremost as a vessel, as a surrogate, not substituting for the dead, but rather bringing forth their experience. To approach, right, Didier Berman, is not to appropriate. It is not speaking for, but rather feeling for, feeling with. I'm thinking of the co-witnessing discussion we had yesterday, bringing that feeling forth by triggering empathy in the viewer of the artwork. Vicariousness for Harvey doubles as a universal ethical practice, breeding responsibility for the other. It is, I quote, the life-preserving condition of some vital part of an event occurring through imagination. Any commonality between witness and experiencing subject is the product of an osmosis, Harvey writes, through which I might listen differently, you through me through you, in order to spare us both, end of quote. This symbiosis of the senses becomes the cornerstone of a new community practice. It is through bodies that the merging happens, through bodily utterances. The vicariousness of the process, the query, the role and ability of aesthetics to give access to a bodily experience through artistic medium, questions its power to effect sensory inscription into the sensible, to restore visibility and to grant it existence. I would like to end with one more gesture that I believe is performed by this mode of sensory witness, which has to do with this concept of the universal, which I do not necessarily, which is coming from Harvey in relation to witnessness, which I do not necessarily understand within the ambit of Western philosophy, not as an exhaustive concept drawn from Aristotle's metaphysics, for instance, the universal in opposition to the particular, that which is valid for all in a flattened out concept of the human, but rather a sort of commonality. So a kernel of commonality cognizant of various subject positions, obviously being a viewer and being a subject experiencing resolve as a drowning migrant are two very different positions. But what is interesting is that this shared kernel of potential exposure suffered to the point of obliteration for some populations across the globe is also present as a vulnerability lurking everywhere. If physical integrity and forced immersion does not bring with equal urgency in all viewers, what we all share is an increased vulnerability at the hands of a logic of accumulation that is endangering both social relations and environmental survival. And this will strike a chord globally, no matter where we are situated on the spectrum. In other words, we're all in the same boat. Witnessness induced by the sensory work to raise awareness of our common vulnerability showcases our common belonging to a precaritized order of the human. And so to finish then, I would like to link this reflection back to the work that I tried to do through my query into the nature of water, my investigation into the nature of water, where I would like to propose this idea of corporeality as a marker of our porosity. So to each other, we all commune in the commons, that is water, but also we're all porous to the more than human world, making us all by virtue of our common humanity subject to various degrees of exposure. And this is also a way to suggest a new collective, one that would be cognizant of this porosity, perhaps one reclaiming it and our reappraised place in nature, not from a standpoint of any kind of anthropological mastery, but a position where multiple forms of life, biotic, non-biotic, human, more than human, are considered, and different forms of life whose survival implies solidarity with all other forms of life writ large. In other words, it points the way to a reconfiguration of human ontologies that would be attentive to the reality of life writ large in the wounded world. And I will stop here, but I'm very happy to develop any of this in the Q&A. Thank you. Yes, let's have a seat.